The Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues will come to order. It's a pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel of government witnesses and my colleagues. The focus of today's hearing is on state and USAID's budget priorities for the Western Hemisphere and how the budget can best complement and support U.S. interests and policy goals for this very, very important region. I want to thank Senator Rubio and his team for their help framing up this hearing. I'm proud of the work we've done on the region thus far during our time in the Senate together. We've kind of been trading chair and ranking back and forth, but we've been good partners, whatever the lineup. The U.S. and our 34 neighbors in the hemisphere share deep ties and a close history. Our collective prosperity and security are deeply intertwined. The U.S. people-to-people ties with the Western Hemisphere are extraordinarily robust, with proud diaspora communities in Virginia, Florida, all of our states, all across the country. And in this region, we see a mutual commitment to democracy and free markets. We also see evidence of backsliding in areas where we have to pay special attention. The economic ties in this hemisphere are similarly deep. During the first 6 months of 2022, U.S. trade in goods with the region totaled $568 billion. I'm often kind of poking our statisticians to say trade in goods is one thing, but trade in services is often growing much faster, and we don't necessarily capture that, and we need to. This trade in goods has rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, which is really important. But despite that, the U.S. and the region as a whole are confronting a multitude of challenges across the hemisphere, and these are the challenges that a robust budget should be prioritized to address. Despite being home to some of the world's most vibrant and active democracies, the hemisphere has also experienced, by most metrics, the sharpest decline in its democratic institutions of any region in the 21st century. This includes worsening repression in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, the collapse of Haiti's government, political violence in Ecuador, instability in Peru. The erosion of democracy and surge in political unrest leads to an increase in irregular migration flows. It creates opportunities for encroachment by foreign adversaries such as the People's Republic of China, which exploits corruption and weak institutions to its advantage. It benefits cartels who further weaken and corrupt state institutions. The reach of narco-trafficking networks is expanding. Fentanyl trafficking conducted by professional smugglers via Mexico to the United States has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans through fatal overdoses, leading the Senate in the recently passed National Defense Authorizing Act to declare the fentanyl crisis a national security emergency. The COVID-19 pandemic also swept away more than a decade of development gains, and it's led to increases in food insecurity and humanitarian challenges such as human trafficking and increases in poverty. So the U.S. assistance to the region is vital in shoring up U.S. interests and democratic principles, as well as the overall stability of the region in the face of these challenges. Every crisis faced by the region and its people deeply and directly impacts the United States, so our wise use of U.S. dollars to promote stability is not just a benefit to others, it's a benefit to American citizens. The region faces challenges, but sometimes we focus only on challenges and we neglect to talk about bright spots, and we should always talk about bright spots. Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic have established the Alliance for Development and Democracy. Ecuador's previous government was part of that. There's a question about Ecuador's commitment going forward, but at least these three nations in establishing the alliance have reaffirmed their support for strengthening of democratic institutions and promoting economic prosperity in their nations. While the Venezuelan crisis is one of the world's most pressing humanitarian emergencies, neighboring countries like Colombia and Peru, Chile have stepped up and generously hosted millions of Venezuelans who have fled their home country. That has to be acknowledged and appreciated. And in the Caribbean, the vast majority of countries remain robust democracies and close U.S. partners. As our neighbors face difficult crises, the U.S. can't stand on the sidelines. We owe to our partners and allies, to our friends and families in the region, to take initiative and accountability in addressing these challenges. I've maintained since joining this committee when I came to the Senate in 2013 that we should pay more attention to the Americas, not less, and that if we did, it would have tremendous benefit not only for the region but for us. Now, we're in a tough fiscal environment. We're in the middle of quite a budgetary discussion right now, so it's important to ensure that precious taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely, that they're advancing U.S. values and interests, and I'm interested in hearing from all of our esteemed witnesses today about how the Department of State and USAID are acting on administration priorities for the region and how funding will be targeted to help friends in the hemisphere tackle shared challenges. Let me now turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Rubio, for his remarks before I introduce the panel.
Thank you, and thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you all for coming and for your service. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I've already told the chairman. What I'm going to try to do here is I have my other Intelligence Committee hat has called me to this meeting in about 5 minutes. So hopefully that will last about as long as your opening statements. Not that they're not great, but they're in writing. And then hopefully I'll be back in time to answer questions. But what I thought I would do in my opening is sort of give you a preview of what I want to ask. So, in case that helps when I get back here to shorten the time frame. On Venezuela, the regime there is they've set up this election commission, which they've staffed with their own people. They've banned the leading opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, from running. This is certainly not a free and fair election, yet somehow they and others in the region are under the perception that some sanctions relief may be on the way if they're able to conduct what is not a free and fair election, but at least can cosmetically cover for it. They are under that impression. Some, including in the regime, are under that impression from what they're telling others in the region. So I really think it's important to know what's been communicated to the Maduro regime about what these expectations are and so forth. The second topic related to this one, and the chairman mentioned it about the Venezuelan migration, I believe over the break while we were gone, I don't know if it was last week or just in the month of August, there was a record number of both Venezuelan and Ecuadorian migrants who were encountered in the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. So the calculation is in about 5 to 6 weeks or less, some of those folks will begin arriving at our southern border. And I'm really interested to know how that correlates or how we work with not just the other countries in transit, but ultimately how we work with our own immigration enforcement officials to prepare for that sort of surge if you can see it coming 6 weeks ahead of time, 5 weeks ahead of time. And the addition, there's always been Ecuadorians, but not at large numbers like we're seeing now. Clearly that has a lot to do with a deteriorating security situation. We've seen these Colombian cartel groups and so forth now operating using Ecuadorian territory as transit areas, and it's really added to that. And Mexico, I think about all the benefits of the trade agreement with Mexico, a lot of offshoring, a lot of reshoring going on in terms of small manufacturers and others moving operations from Asia to Mexico. This is great. About 40% of that activity happens in a place called Nuevo Laredo, which also happens to be under the control of the Zeta cartels. And they are using the same mechanisms of trade to embed fentanyl and other things into our country. And so I wonder how that works with our conversations. Look, the government doesn't control that city. It's just, frankly, a real strange situation. On the one hand, we want trade, we want commerce, we want that, but they are using the mechanisms in one particular place that encounters 40% of that trade. It's a huge vulnerability. The chairman mentioned Peru has had some instability. From my reading of it, it is a little bit more stably than, is that a right term? It looks like it's trending in at least in a more stable direction from what it used to be, but obviously still not ideal. But there appears to be potentially an opening now for more cooperation with the existing administration to be able to work on some things with them. I think they're a willing partner on a number of topics, and I'm curious to see what work we've done in that regard. And last, and kind of an overarching theme, and I'll allow you to, when I get back, we can discuss it more in depth, and it really is the one I wanted to focus on as much as anything else today. I just wanted to share with you, and this is my impressions, maybe others get different feedback, but as I meet with leaders and others in the area, there's this perception. This is what I'm told. I'm going to kind of give it to you verbatim. It's better to be America's adversary or irritant than it is to be America's ally. If you're an irritant, or if you're not always falling in line or doing the things that the U.S. hopes you will do, you seem to get a lot more attention. You seem to get meetings. You seem to get efforts to lift sanctions or other measures to sort of entice you to the light and away from the dark side. If, on the other hand, you are some of these countries, the Dominican Republic is an example, that clearly and openly wants to align with the U.S., you get travel advisories, you get commercial sanctions and things of that nature with regards to some of the things that have happened there earlier in the year. A sense that we punish our friends and we reward, or at least try to appease, those who are viewed as irritants or even adversaries. That perception, and I've had leaders frankly tell me it may be better off to be against the United States. By the way, this pre-exists this administration. I mean, these are complaints I've heard in under previous administrations at some point in the past. But how do we address that? Because that doesn't mean we have to agree with everything our allies are doing, but we probably live in a time now where we need to be pretty clear about we're going to be good to our friends, and we're going to confront our adversaries and those who clearly are undertaking steps that undermine our national interest and national security. So that's more of an overarching theme, but one I hope we'll touch on. And so hopefully I'll be right back, and I'll be able, by the time I get here, if the timing is perfect, we'll be in questions. Thank you so much.
We will do a lot of filibustering until you get back, so you're going to have plenty of opportunity to talk to these witnesses. Thanks, Senator Rubio. Let me now introduce the panel. And then after I do the introductions, I will ask you to do your 5-minute opening statements in the order that I introduce you. Brian Nichols is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. He previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe, and before that, Ambassador to Peru. He was previously the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, and served as DCM in Colombia. In May, President Biden nominated Mr. Nichols for the rank of Career Ambassador, which is the highest rank in the Foreign Service. Next, Marcela Escobari. Dr. Escobari is the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She previously served in this role in 2016, helping reinforce U.S. support for Peace Colombia, mobilize humanitarian response to Hurricane Matthew in Haiti, and support efforts to deliver humanitarian aid in Venezuela. Prior to government service, Ms. Escobari was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, the executive director at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. I think that's why I called you doctor, and maybe you're not a doctor, but I saw those universities. You'll take doctor? All right. Both Assistant Secretary Nichols and Assistant Administrator Escobari were witnesses at our recent hearing on Haiti, and I thank them for their willingness to appear again to talk about budget on short notice. Finally, Todd Robinson, the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at State. Most recently, he served as the Director of International Student Management Office at the National Defense University, an important billet where we bring folks from around the world to train together with Americans. Prior to his assignment at NDU, he served as Senior Advisor for Central America in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. He was also the Charge d'Affaires in Caracas, Venezuela, and the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Guatemala. We're grateful to have the three of you here. Thank you for your service. And I'd now like to ask, in the order that I introduced you, to offer your opening remarks. Your written comments are in the record. Confine your opening remarks, please, to 5 minutes, and then we'll jump into questions. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you, Chairman Kaine, Ranking Member Rubio and Abstentia, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to speak with you about the administration's proposed fiscal year 2024 budget for the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is experiencing its most pivotal moment in the last 30 years. The ability of the United States to advance its national security interests in response to regional and global challenges requires a clear articulation of our approach to the Western Hemisphere. The Department's fiscal year 2024 budget request demonstrates our sustained engagement in support of the President's long-term vision for a secure, middle-class, and democratic hemisphere, in contrast to the transactional approach of our strategic competitors. The Department's economic policies and programs in the Western Hemisphere focus on working with the region to create sustainable growth, support workers' rights, and root out corruption. Funding for initiatives that the White House announced at the 9th Summit of the Americas will further enhance regional economic integration and shared well-being, including through America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Countries in the region also want us to present a viable alternative to PRC economic engagement. It is vital that we answer their call. To respond effectively, the United States will deploy the full toolkit at our disposal. Most countries in the Western Hemisphere view the United States as the natural partner on matters of governance, rule of law, and human rights. Citizens welcome our engagement and consultation with diverse stakeholders to advance regional support for democracy. Bolstering democratic institutions and support to civil society, democratic actors, and independent media helps us push back against democratic backsliding, corruption, and the false narratives perpetuated by illiberal regimes. Our proposed budget uses diplomatic engagement and foreign assistance strategically to build security partnerships. We help our partners analyze the risks of working with strategic adversaries, and we help them develop safeguards against cyber attacks, illegal resource extraction, and other problematic activities. We work with our partners to combat transnational crime organizations and gangs and protect American lives by combating the illegal production and trafficking of fentanyl, cocaine, and other illicit drugs. These investments are vital to our neighbors' safety, prosperity, and democratic future, as well as our own. This budget prioritizes comprehensive solutions to address the political, economic, and security challenges driving forced displacement and irregular migration. We request $979 million for the State Department and USAID to implement the U.S. strategy for addressing the root causes of migration in Central America in alignment with the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act. The budget also includes $184 million in bilateral and regional assistance for programs that advance lawful pathways, integrate refugees and migrants, and stabilize the communities hosting them. Of this amount, $51 million for the America's Partnership Opportunity Fund will help countries take responsibility for long-term migration management through sustainable public planning and community-based solutions. Additional funds used to message directly to prospective migrants will raise awareness of ongoing U.S. border enforcement, the dangers of irregular migration, and the availability of lawful migration pathways. The budget includes more than $291 million for Haiti to address long-standing food insecurity, political instability, and gang activity, and advances the objectives of the 10-year plan to implement the U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability in Haiti. Efforts to combat gang activity focus on enhanced training and equipment for the Haitian National Police. We also focus on improving health and education outcomes, advancing economic and food security, and improving the independence and accountability of government institutions. In coordination with the interagency, we will continue to evaluate assistance options to support a multinational security support mission. We seek to build a more stable and economically viable Haiti, working with Haitian actors to find a way forward. Finally, the budget includes $370 million to build climate resilience through programs that contribute to protecting biospheres like the Amazon, advancing clean energy solutions, enhancing food security, building early warning and response systems for natural disasters, and improving enforcement to combat environmental crimes. Our budget priorities for the Western Hemisphere envision a hemisphere that thrives together to benefit the American people. I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you, Secretary Nichols. Administrator Escobari.
Chairman Kaine, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today about USAID's FY24 budget request for Latin America and the Caribbean. The region is facing profound challenges, from historic levels of migration, democratic backsliding, to acute instability in places like Haiti. With the President's request of $1.8 billion for USAID in the region, we can help our neighbors respond to these challenges, maintain our role as the region's preferred partner, and provide an alternative to the approach of the PRC. USAID is there when disaster strikes. So far this year, USAID has provided nearly $282 million in emergency response in 13 countries across the hemisphere. During the pandemic, we helped deliver 70 million vaccines and contributed to a regional vaccination rate of over 70%. And we are requesting now $54 million to strengthen health systems for future health threats. And we support the Haitian people whose lives have been upended by gang violence, providing food assistance to hundreds of thousands, keeping over 160 clinics open, and increasing rural livelihoods. And as support builds for a multinational force, there is a narrow window of opportunity for our hemisphere to show that we stand with our Haitian neighbors. The requested $246 million will allow us to improve citizen security in high-violence communities and chart the path toward elections. And even as we respond to acute crises, we stay focused on the long term. We have partnered with Colombia across 5 administrations, supporting their transition from war to peace. Together, we've ensured that victims of the armed conflict can find justice. We've brought opportunity to isolated communities, and we've helped farmers transition to legal crops. But this progress is fragile, so our continued investment ensures that those gains take root. USAID also invests in institutions like Zamorano or Earth University that are producing thousands of change makers in their own countries. And we invest in people, training the journalists and civil society groups that expose corruption, or the judges and prosecutors who bolster the rule of law. These leaders are at the forefront of building more democratic and prosperous societies. And we're seeing that play out in Guatemala right now. After attempts to undermine the recent election, it is the Guatemalan people who have taken to the streets to defend their democracy, and they are prevailing. This budget requests $535 million to continue our wide-ranging work to defend democracy. Inequality and slow growth also contribute to the reduced faith in democracy that we see in much of the region. So USAID works to advance inclusive economic opportunity. We've brought technology to smallholder farmers, microcredit and connectivity to those on the periphery of economic hubs, and job skills to at-risk youth. And we also create the conditions for increased FDI through faster customs in Central America and financing tools to attract investments in renewables throughout the Caribbean. This approach leverages our comparative advantage vis-à-vis China, our dynamic private sector. The requested budget will also allow us to continue tackling other big challenges, like the historic displacement of people across the hemisphere. To meet the moment, USAID takes a 3-pronged approach. First, we address the root causes by creating economic opportunity and tackling insecurity and corruption, and making it possible for people to stay in their communities. Second, we expand lawful pathways. Our work with Northern Central American governments has helped double the number of H-2 visas, allowing people to find lawful work and fill labor gaps here across America. And third, we support the integration of migrants into host communities. We've partnered with Colombia and Ecuador as they implement generous policies that have helped Venezuelans access schools, healthcare, jobs, and settle where they are. The $83 million in this budget and the $200 million supplemental request will ensure that we can help these policies succeed. At the root of this massive displacement is the crisis in Venezuela. Venezuela's economy and democratic institutions have been decimated by 20 years of mismanagement. We are not naive about the prospects of free and fair elections in Maduro's Venezuela. But 2024 presents a real opportunity for Venezuelans to demand the right to choose their leaders. And the energy that we have seen behind the opposition primaries show that Venezuelans have not given up hope. USAID will continue to support voices pushing back against repression and mobilizing for competitive elections. The President's budget request will allow us to respond to this critical moment and build a more stable future for our hemisphere. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Robinson.
Chairman Kaine, Ranking Member Rubio, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. The Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs is responsible for nearly $1.4 billion of foreign assistance globally under the INCL account request. This includes $536.5 million in INCL funding for the Western Hemisphere, and which is about 38% of the total INCL request. Countering the flow of fentanyl and its precursors is a top priority for President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and me. The State Department is leading a global response to the synthetic drug challenge by disrupting transnational criminal organizations' ability to produce, traffic, and profit from these deadly substances. Most fentanyl seized in the United States is trafficked through Mexico using diverted precursor chemicals sourced from the People's Republic of China. To disrupt the flow of precursor chemicals, engagement with the PRC and others is critical to better track and control these chemicals. Cooperation with Mexico is critical to the success of our efforts to combat the fentanyl crisis. To this end, we have requested $48 million to support programming in Mexico. We have provided more than 500 canines to Mexican agencies to assist in seizures of fentanyl and other drugs. These canines have supported 50 fentanyl seizures, including more than 485,000 fentanyl pills and over 2,000 kilos of fentanyl powder, as well as 2,700 doses of liquid fentanyl, representing hundreds of thousands of lives potentially saved. Nevertheless, we cannot ignore other counter-narcotics challenges in our hemisphere. Our approach in Colombia and Peru has evolved from a focus on cocaine reduction into also addressing factors enabling production and trafficking. This includes promoting rural security, justice, and development, drug demand reduction, and addressing corruption and money laundering. In Ecuador, which is facing unprecedented levels of violence, including the recent assassinations of a presidential candidate and a mayor, INL programs aim to enhance security in critical trafficking zones. We are requesting $15 million to expand our support to counter criminal activity, reduce the flow of cocaine to the United States, and strengthen the judicial sector to combat TCOs. With INL assistance, the government launched a specialized court, the government in Ecuador launched a specialized court in 2022 with jurisdiction over drug trafficking, human trafficking, kidnapping, and money laundering cases. That court delivered its first convictions on July 31st and August 2nd, sentencing 34 gang members. In Haiti, INL is building the Haitian National Police capacity to counter the violent gangs driving instability. INL has allocated $122 million since July 2021 to strengthen the HMP's capacity to counter gangs. This effort is complementary to the ongoing development of a multinational security support mission to provide security and support to the HMP in its efforts to counter gangs, safeguard critical infrastructure, and protect citizens. Through $29 million for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, INL programming will continue to reduce the trafficking of narcotics and illicit firearms, disrupt organized crime, and promote regional cooperation. In Central America, INL efforts focus on reducing the governance and security drivers of irregular migration. Through $191 million requested under the Central American Regional Security Initiative, programs to improve community policing and engage youth deter gang influence and crime. In the Southern Cone, we work closely with Brazil to counter TCO's trafficking of drugs and natural resources across the Amazon basin, and with Argentina to thwart the increasing threat of synthetic drugs and diversion of precursor chemicals. Getting ahead of all of these threats requires strategic and innovative thinking. The challenges before us are immense, but I'm confident we can address them together to keep our country and people safe. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Robinson. We'll have 5-minute rounds of questions, and I have a million questions, budgetary and non-budgetary, but this is a budgetary hearing, so I'm going to focus mostly on the budget, but I do want to ask one non-budgetary question about Haiti, given the fact that we were here recently in this subcommittee talking about Haiti, and at the time there was some not expectation necessarily, but optimism about finding a partner to lead the multinational security effort. It was reported in the news that there had been discussions with Kenya about it. Is there anything new to report about whether there is a nation that is going to step up and lead a multinational effort to enhance security in Haiti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been notable progress in that regard. A delegation of Kenyan experts traveled to Haiti to carry out an assessment. The Kenyan government and Kenyan security forces have ample experience in peacekeeping on the continent and beyond, and they came back from their assessment with a very sophisticated view of the situation in Haiti. You would think they'd been studying it for decades, and they talked about their willingness to lead a mission. That process of deeper analysis of what would be required is ongoing in Nairobi. And much like the United States, Kenya requires legislative approval to carry out such a task. I should note that my colleague, Assistant Secretary Robinson, traveled to Nairobi and met with the Kenyans before they went to Haiti, and I'm sure he'll have some thoughts on this as well. The Security Council is currently debating a resolution which would authorize a multinational security support mission, and we hope that such a resolution could be approved by the time of Leaders Week in New York, the week of the 18th.
Good. Well, that's encouraging, and I would obviously Kenya's willingness to take a leadership role depends upon the willingness of other nations to play major roles in participating. The U.S. Is willing to do so. So we'll hope to have positive developments on that. This is a question for Administrator Escobar and Secretary Nichols. Compared with the FY 2023 budget, the administration has proposed a $307 million increase in development assistance funding for the region, and that's nearly a 46% increase, with the majority of the additional assistance allocated to activities intended to address root causes of migration from Central America and also to support democratic institutions in Haiti. Can you elaborate on how the increase in development assistance funds can be used to bolster democratic institutions in the region? For Secretary Nichols and Administrator Escobar.
I'd understood that was for Secretary Robinson and Administrator Escobar. I apologize. Our focus is very much on addressing the root causes of the drivers of irregular migration and democratic instability. That includes focusing on improving people's daily livelihoods, providing support to develop the kinds of infrastructure that people need, supporting civil society, an independent press, and the kinds of government institutions that will promote better policies and livelihoods for the peoples of our region. We're focused on this crucial moment, as I said in my opening remarks. We need to deliver across a whole host of areas for the peoples of this region. A key area of that is security. Crime and insecurity in places like Ecuador are driving irregular migration across our region. The lack of democratic opportunity in Venezuela similarly drives that irregular migration. These programs take time to have an impact, but we are seeing progress in a number of areas.
Let me say this before I turn to Senator Murphy. I do want to connect with the comments made by Ranking Member Rubio in his opening. I feel like one of the challenges we have in the region is that we often do not pay enough attention to our friends. And the Ecuador situation seems to me a good example of this. I visited with President Lasso shortly after he was elected, and then together with Senator Menendez was with him shortly before he stepped down. And there was a consistent ask during the Lasso administration, please engage with us on a trade deal of some kind, add us into an existing one or do something significant. And, you know, the administration's position is trade deals aren't good politics anymore. That was the only ask. And I'm not sure that had a trade deal happened, the results would have been dramatically different. But when you have a nation that went from pro-China to pro-America and they had one ask of us and we couldn't produce, and now the situation in Ecuador is leading to more, the violence is leading to more Ecuador and migration, people coming through the Darien Gap. and may well lead to a government that is once again hostile to the United States, as the Ecuadorian government was for decades. We miss opportunities with our friends. We do some things right. The chips manufacturing bill that we did included a component for international manufacturing in friendly nations for nearshoring, and we made an investment in chips manufacturing capacity in Costa Rica. That's a positive. But I do want to associate myself with comments that Senator Rubio made, that we should be really focusing upon some of the bright spots and helping our neighbors that are doing well to do even better, and that can be a great example in the region. I turn now to Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for pulling together this hearing. I have two questions, one on budget and one on policy. On budget, I will note that when we talk about the work that we need to do with Mexico and other partners to counter the flow of fentanyl to the United States, there is funding both in the state and foreign ops budget, but also in the Homeland Security budget. That's the subcommittee of appropriations that I chair. In fact, we have nearly $1 billion in dedicated funding to help Homeland Security agencies work with the Mexican government. That's a record amount of funding. And I will also note that the Senate is taking this fight pretty seriously. As you know, the state and foreign ops budget has $125 million in dedicated counter-fentanyl funding globally. Again, we've got about $850 million in the Homeland budget. The House has allocated virtually nothing to this fight. And so hopefully we can convince our House colleagues to work with us to get serious. But I wanted to talk for a minute, and I'll ask this question to you, Ambassador Robinson, about the degree of cooperation we're getting from Mexico. And I'll just put a specific example on the table and ask you to respond. The port of Manzanillo is a really important port. That's where a lot of this precursor comes through. And we know a lot of it is moving pretty freely to the cartels. We know that there's an opportunity to interrupt a lot of that trade, and we know that that's probably the more effective means to do it instead of waiting until it arrives at our southern border. My understanding is we have had an offer on the table to work with the Mexican government to partner our expertise with their expertise to better identify and intercept fentanyl and fentanyl precursor at that specific port, but that offer still remains on the table, that the ball is effectively in the Mexican government's court. We have funding funding proposed to help fund that partnership, but it appears as one of perhaps several offers that we have made that have not yet been accepted by the Mexican government. So can you give us an update on that specific proposal that we've made and how it sits in the context of overall Mexican government cooperation?
Sure. Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. Our relationship with Mexico on this issue is of the highest importance. My understanding is our colleagues in DHS and DEA are continuing to talk with their Mexican counterparts on specifically what we can do at the Port of Manzanillo. I think everyone recognizes that this is a key entrance point for precursor chemicals. Those talks are ongoing. Overall, I would say that our relationship across the board with our Mexican counterparts is quite good on operations at the border. We're looking at what we can do together to secure and shore up our border locations. There is no doubt that there are differences between what certain members of the Mexican government say regarding precursor chemicals and the production of fentanyl in Mexico. But despite those differences of opinion, the relationship, the operational relationship remains on track.
Well, listen, I'm proud of the funding that we have put forward, but it is dependent upon having a willing partner. And these discussions that you reference around this particular port have been going on for a very long time. And it suggests that we might not, at least on this set of potential cooperative efforts, not have a partner as willing as we would like. My policy-related question will elicit an answer that will go far beyond my time, so I will just reference it and put it on the record. I'm very interested to continue a conversation we've been having, Ambassador Nichols, on the efficacy of Venezuela sanctions and to get an update from the administration as to the purpose of a set of sanctions that have, frankly, not effectuated results in the way that we had hoped. Obviously, we're coming up on an election in Venezuela that we hope is as open and fair and as free as possible. And I think it's important that we continue to have a conversation as to what we are getting for a sanctions policy that is often making us look pretty feckless with our partners around the world. So I will submit that question to for the record and yield back my time.
Thank you. Chairman Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on the Western Hemisphere and its budget priorities, and for putting an august panel together. We welcome you all. Fentanyl is the leading cause of drug overdose deaths in the United States, including in my home state of New Jersey, with a staggering 193 persons a day dying from fentanyl poisoning. We know that the vast majority of fentanyl trafficked into the United States is produced in clandestine labs in Mexico with precursor chemicals sourced from the PRC, something the Mexican president says doesn't even exist. So it's a little hard to deal with a partner when they start off from taking the proposition at the highest levels of government doesn't even exist. While Mexico's commitment has been, generously to say, slow to come around, and we must recognize that realistic solutions to this crisis, I hope, as some are suggesting, U.S. military troops or bombs in Mexico. That's pretty outrageous. Sovereign country. As much as I don't like their lack of cooperation, that's pretty outrageous. But instead, it seems to me we require greatly improved law enforcement cooperation and greater port and border security measures. Assistant Secretary Robinson, INL's budget request for Mexico does not speak, in my view, to the urgency of the challenge at hand, but it does indicate the challenges we've had in bilateral cooperation. It also doesn't capture the whole host of initiatives that the administration is carrying out to combat the crisis. Can you please lay out the work the administration is doing, and have you seen sufficient political will from the government of Mexico to effectively tackle the fentanyl crisis? I heard your answer to Senator Murphy. It was very diplomatic, but that's not what I'm looking for.
Thank you, Senator and Chairman, for that question. First, let me just say the challenge. To be honest, the challenge that we have with Mexico is their unwillingness to put their resources into the sufficient resources into the fight, and we are pushing them to do that. The partners that we are working with want to do more. They want to do better. They want to be. They want to partner with us on greater security, both in Mexico and at the border, their northern border and our southern border. The resources on the Mexican side up to this point have not been sufficient to the task, and we continue to engage with them on that.
Well, you tell me where your resources are, I'll tell you where your priorities are. And if the resources aren't there, that's not a priority for the Mexican government.
Well, we will.
So you can't have a partner unless you have both sides of the equation working towards the same goal.
Well, what I will say is we will continue to engage with our Mexican counterparts, both diplomatically and at the operational level, to see if we can't convince them that they need to put more resources in that.
At some point, if we keep doing the same thing, it doesn't work. You have to think about what other consequences there should be. This year alone, there have been over 2,400 murders and 950 kidnappings in Haiti. This has been the direct result of a worsening epidemic of gang violence and widespread criminal collusion between Haitian elites and gangs, an issue that I'm working to address through my Haitian Criminal Collusion Transparency Act. Given the appalling security situation in Haiti, I agree with the UN Secretary General's assessment that, quote, a robust use of force, close quote, by a multinational police force is necessary to help restore law and order. We have seen that the Kenyan government has offered to lead such a force and conducted an assessment trip to Haiti last month. Sister Secretary Robinson, now that Kenyan assessment trip has concluded, what can you share about the specific resources the U.S. government plans to contribute to the multinational force, including any police or military assets, logistics support, and other financial resources? And what progress, concrete progress, has been made in securing commitments from other nations to the multinational force?
Thank you again, Senator Menendez, Chairman Menendez, for that question. I was fortunate enough to go to Nairobi and speak with the Kenyans directly. We are grateful that they are considering this proposal to lead this multinational support operation. We have committed to them that we are going to work with our international partners to make sure that they have the tools and the funding necessary. We have identified a substantial amount, both the State Department and the Department of Defense have identified a substantial amount to kick off the beginning of that funding, but we understand that we are not going to be able to do this alone. We are reaching out to partners in the region. We're reaching out to partners outside of the region, both for materiel, for personnel, and for financial resources.
Well, could we engage with you on this to find out exactly where we're at on those efforts?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, if I may, one last question. Administrator Escobar, good to see you. I put out a paper on migration called the Menendez Plan. It recognizes that there are 20 million people in the Western Hemisphere, 20 million, who are displaced, refugees, or seeking asylum in other countries. Unless we deal with that reality, then the challenges that we have at the southern border will be minor today compared to 20 million people who, if they cannot be assimilated in these countries, will come marching north. And that will be a major crisis. So I see that as part of this effort, I have legislation forthcoming on Venezuela that has $300 million in assistance to Latin American communities hosting large numbers of refugees and migrants. I understand the President's supplemental budget request includes $200 million to expand integration efforts. Can you help us understand in practical terms how important it is to have this additional funding for integrating refugees and migrants within the hemisphere itself?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. And you're absolutely right. And the reason we put those funds in the supplemental is because the timing couldn't be more consequential. Of those 20 million people that are internally displaced, 7 million have come solely from Venezuela, and it's now 7.5. And that's new. These are historic levels for the region. And the main countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil, have taken on over 85% of that displacement. So it's through their policies that their generous and pragmatic policies of integration that these migrants are being absorbed in these communities, they're being provided jobs, healthcare, schools, but it's a very tenuous moment because these policies have a high upfront cost, even if eventually migrants end up contributing robustly to those economies. The upfront cost is high, so it's straining local budgets, and the political cost is high. So our ability to support our partners in integration, in policies that help them validate degrees, in providing schools and healthcare, and the regularization process, really, as you said, will make a difference on whether those people can restart their lives in these countries, or they will continue onward migration to our border.
Well, we will either help them there, or they will be knocking on the door here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Ender. Senator Haggerty.
Thank you, Chairman Kaine. I'd like to turn my attention to you, Secretary Nicholas. It's good to see you here today. In the FY 2024 budget request that you've got, there's over $1 billion in the budget request for law enforcement in other countries. Law enforcement in Latin America, places like Colombia, where policing needs to be reinforced, dealing with counter-narcotics trafficking and that sort of thing. Are you in support of this element of the FY 2024 budget request?
Thank you, Senator. Great to see you again. In order to provide our partners around the hemisphere with a better future that addresses the issues that affect us directly, like illicit narcotics trafficking, fentanyl, irregular migration, we need to address these problems where they are. And that means strengthening law enforcement capacity, judicial capacity, corrections capacity in the region. That's vital.
And that would keep that from bleeding over into America.
Absolutely,
Isn't
Senator.
that the aim? I presume then you would oppose defunding this component of the FY 2024 budget request.
Absolutely, Senator.
I'm trying to then reconcile that. I've been reviewing the President's language on the ability to keep our economy open, our government open past September the 30th. In the language that the White House has sent over with the continuing resolution, there's a component of that that would essentially defund the agency here in America that is responsible for law enforcement, protecting our border, for deporting those who enter our country illegally. It's very shocking to me that in order to avoid a government shutdown, the President is demanding the ability to defund ICE here in America. And I'd like to read directly from this language that the President has sent over to avoid a shutdown. Amounts made available to U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement operations and support in this or any other act may be used to provide services and support for refugees, referrals for social services and other related programs, funded through contracts or through the award of grants or cooperative agreements to non-governmental organizations. What this is saying is that the administration wants the authority to reprogram over $7 billion per year of ICE funding away from law enforcement and essentially turn ICE into a travel agency to facilitate the transportation of illegal immigrants to cities like New York. I think you've probably seen Mayor Adams and what's happening there in New York, to cities like mine or to yours. I find this very shocking. I find it very concerning, in fact. And I wonder if you've had the opportunity to review this, and would you support that?
Senator, the process of enforcing our immigration laws is vital, but it doesn't just depend on the enforcement agencies. We have to be able to house migrants who are here irregularly.
Well, I think if you take the ability, the enforcement agency that is responsible for deporting those people here illegally, for buying the tickets to send them home, is now going to be turned, according to this language. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without
Page
objection.
41 of the language that comes along with this request to keep the government open past September the 30th would require this administration, the Biden administration, to have the ability to reprogram the entirety, over $7 billion per year, of funding toward relocation of people into America. It's going to create a magnet, if you will. It will undermine, it'll overwhelm, frankly, north of $7 billion per year, the $1 billion that's being requested in your budget. I think that's a great concern. It should be a concern to you.
Well, I'm not an official with the DHS, but I will say that our partners in DHS need the ability to facilitate the repatriation of those persons not found to have a reason to remain in the United States. They are under various judicial orders that they cannot hold migrants beyond a certain period of time. You need someplace to refer those people to.
I hear that, but this would allow the administration to reverse all the funds that would be necessary to send those people back. They'd have the authority now to convert all of those funds into a resettlement program. And if you saw the video that I saw this morning of Mayor Adams in New York City talking about what's happening to his city right now, he's saying that this illegal immigration is destroying his city. This provision, if we allow it to pass, will enable that. It's very disappointing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hagerty. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all of your testimony and expertise. I want to start on the topic of Honduras. President Castro presented a new opportunity to address corruption In the past, Honduras had had a commission, CC, that is the commission known as the International Commission Against Corruption and Impunity. And it was very effective in bringing to Honduras many of the tools of investigation and prosecution to hold top-level corruption accountable. And that is quite contrary to kind of the tradition of impunity that has characterized so many governments in Central America. The previous president dismantled that because of basically many of his colleagues were getting investigated, his family was getting investigated. We, the United States, have expressed a lot of support for supporting President Castro in taking on corruption. But right now, that process of reestablishing Sisi is stalled. So what's going on? And let me just add how important this is. The drug trafficking corruption extends often throughout the political system. It infiltrates the police, it infiltrates the military. As one president in Central America told me, the drug structures extend right down to the street level where virtually every business pays protection money. But if it's not addressed at the top, then it just isn't going to change. And the type of oppression that comes from these criminal enterprises certainly is a big factor in driving people desperately to the north. So why is it that the work to reestablish CC is stalled, and what can be done about it? And Secretary Nichols or Director Escobari, would love to get your insights on that.
Thanks very much. So the commission that existed in Honduras was called MAXI. That was its abbreviation, its acronym in Spanish. That went away under the previous administration, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and President Castro has been working to establish a new commission in partnership with the United Nations in Honduras. They've signed a memorandum of understanding for the creation of this new anti-corruption commission, and they are working on the technical details with the United Nations. I recently spoke to my counterpart in the United Nations, and he assured me that the UN is committed to doing its part to establish this new commission that will aid Honduran institutions to address the issue of corruption. I would note that the ongoing process of electing a new Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General in Honduras is also important because they are the key partners for any international assistance on anti-corruption efforts.
And just to add, Senator, we are also very hopeful that Honduras will fulfill its electoral promise of starting CC. And our understanding is that some of the stalling is around the level of independence provided to this institution, which we think is crucial. But USAID is prepared to make resources available to support CC once it's established, and that's beyond the support of INL and state.
I just want to emphasize how important it is to continue to support the efforts to take on corruption. Without that, many of the programs and efforts that we're undertaking will take us nowhere. I want to turn to safeguarding environmental defenders. Of the 5 countries that account for 80% of the murders of human rights defenders, 4 of them are in Latin America: Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Honduras. This, of course, is devastating to those who are attempting to defend both established environmental preserves, those who are attempting to defend indigenous rights. And there is an appropriation for a USAID advisor for indigenous people, so I'll direct this to you, Director Escobari. How are those efforts going to help assist the frontline defenders, environmental and human rights defenders who are being murdered, to make them, to give them greater protection and work with their governments to give them greater protection?
No, Thank you, Senator, for bringing attention to this issue. And you're correct that Latin America and the Caribbean is the most dangerous region to be an environmental defender. So USAID is working with environmental leaders to protect them from intimidation and violence from armed groups, and is also providing alternative economic options for those who often are forced to engage in illicit activities. Our work, and many times in conjunction with the governments that we work with, is to really strengthen the judicial system so that these crimes can be brought to justice, but also creating protective mechanisms, sometimes community-based and sometimes individualized, and strengthening those protection mechanisms within the countries, often persuading governments to put more funds into them. But we will continue that work because we realize it's incredibly important.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased that the Appropriations Committee here, the SFOPS Committee, State and Foreign Affairs, has continued to see this as well worthy of funding. I think it's incredibly important that we stand with those folks who are attempting to protect human rights, indigenous communities, and the environment. Thank you much.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nichols, I'm deeply concerned that the Western Hemisphere is being overwhelmed by anti-Americanism, and that countries across the region are aligning themselves with our adversaries and our enemies. I'm deeply concerned that former U.S. allies are being replaced by leaders who are actively hostile to us and our interests, and that the Biden administration has chosen to embrace many of those leaders. President Biden warmly hosted Lula da Silva at the White House and called him a close friend. Lula is an anti-American Chavista who embraces the Chinese Communist Party, Vladimir Putin, and the Iranian regime. I'll note that President Biden has not extended the same courtesy to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and indeed the Biden White House has made clear that Israel's Prime Minister is not welcome in the Biden White House. Now, one of the very insidious ways that our adversaries and our enemies have infiltrated the region is through corruption. China, Russia, and Iran all exploit endemic corruption, including and especially corruption driven by left-wing movements to advance their geopolitical agendas. Congress, and specifically this committee, has recognized the importance of combating such corruption and have given you powerful tools, in particular under Section 7031C, sanction authorities. The Biden administration has used these sanctions repeatedly across the Western Hemisphere, but not, I'm dismayed to say, not against the left-wing anti-American communists who are aligning with Russia and China and Iran. Quite the opposite. Again, the Biden administration has looked the other way at malign behavior from such actors. I want to ask you why that is, and I want to start in particular with Argentina. In Argentina, the federal judiciary found Cristina Fernandez, Argentina's former president and current vice president, guilty of overseeing and profiting from fraudulently issued government contracts to her associates for public works. According to the public record, the amounts we're talking about reach $1 billion. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and given a lifetime ban on holding public office. Her current political role grants her immunity from jail, but I'm not aware of any such restriction placed by Congress on you from sanctioning her under Section 7031C. You sanctioned the sitting Paraguayan vice president last year. You've sanctioned former presidents in Panama and Ecuador. No one denies, and in fact, Argentina's courts have confirmed Cristina Fernandez is a kleptocrat. She has been indicted for obstructing investigations into Iranian terrorism. Why has the Biden administration not sanctioned her?
This administration has used the tools for sanctions, both visa and financial sanctions, repeatedly in numerous instances. You talk about sanctioning left-wing leaders. Certainly Nicaragua comes to mind. We've placed sanctions on scores and scores of officials from
Mr.
Nicaragua.
Nichols, my question concerned Argentina. Why have you not sanctioned Fernandez?
So the United States does not discuss pending sanctions actions, so I would not be able to discuss what we will or will not do with regard to
Well, you're
any
refusing to
issue.
answer that, and I have to say this isn't changing. A year ago, I wrote Secretary Blinken about exactly this issue, sanctioning Cristina Fernandez under Section 7031C, and the State Department wrote back, and I'll quote what State said a year ago. Quote, President Biden and Secretary Blinken have made it a priority to fight corruption globally using all legal authorities available to them. That was nonsense then, and it's nonsense now. A year later, it is undisputed that she's a kleptocrat. Why is the Biden State Department giving her a pass?
We evaluate every case on its merits. We don't discuss specific cases before we take action. We have robust
Does
anti-corruption
state have an
programs.
obligation to comply with Congress's oversight?
We
I'm asking
absolutely
you
do.
why you're not following the law, and your answer is we don't answer that question.
Our answer is we don't publicly discuss pending sanctions actions.
Well, it's not pending. It's been sitting there for a long time. All right, let's shift to another example, Brazil. Bolsonaro, a pro-American leader, was replaced, to the Biden administration's cheering, with an anti-American radical Lula. And there is corruption likewise in the Lula government. In February, Lula allowed 2 of Iran's most advanced warships to dock in the port of Rio de Janeiro. The United States opposed that act, at least formally. In fact, the United States sanctioned those ships with what are supposed to be powerful designations, and yet it happened. I believe the Lula government's corruption played a significant role in their decision to ignore the Biden administration and allow the docking. Do you agree with that assessment? And has the Biden administration enforced any sanctions related to that instance, and in particular to the Brazilians providing material support to the Iranian ships?
The administration engaged our partners throughout the hemisphere, and we're very pleased that the Iranian ships were not able to dock anywhere else. We're deeply disappointed that one of the 2 ships was able to dock in Brazil, the other was offshore. I would refer you to OFAC for any additional information on
Has the Biden
sanctions
administration sanctioned the Brazilian government led by Joe Biden's self-described good friend, the anti-American leftist Lula? Have you sanctioned the Brazilian government for violating U.S. law and allowing the Iranian ships to dock?
I would refer you to OFAC as to whether or not they've made a determination that action violated
You don't know whether
sanctions.
you've sanctioned Brazil?
I would refer you to OFAC.
Do you know?
I would refer you to OFAC.
Do you know the answer? That's a yes or no question. Do you know whether the Biden administration has sanctioned Brazil?
I am not aware of any sanctions with regard to that specific situation.
Nor am I, and that's the problem.
I believe Senator Cardin was here at the top of the hearing. Is that correct? Senator Cardin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank all of our witnesses. Secretary Nichols, I want to start with Colombia, if I might. This is one of our longest partnerships in our hemisphere. Senator Hagerty and I co-chair Atlantic Council task force on Colombia. Senator Blunt had that position before. We have been partners with Colombia through Plan Colombia, Peace Colombia, the implementation of the peace agreements. Colombia still has major challenges in counter-narcotics, the peace accord implementation, Venezuelan migrants and their integration into Colombia, forest conservation, et cetera. So the administration's budget requests in excess of $400 million to further that partnership. Our Appropriations Committee has recommended, as I understand it, $487 million, a robust amount, recognizing the importance of our partnership to continue this progress that's been made in that country. The House Appropriations Committee, as I understand, zeroed out the Colombia budget, withheld all the funds. Can you tell me how much of a priority it is for the United States to continue its partnership with Colombia in the areas I just mentioned?
Colombia is a vital partner across a whole host of areas, whether it's safeguarding the environment, dealing with climate change, obviously the overarching threat of transnational organized crime, promoting the respect for human rights. We've worked with Colombia at an unprecedented level of integration for a generation now, since the beginning of Plan Colombia. Our continued cooperation and assistance with Colombia is vital, Senator.
You know, my concern is that it's a robust democracy, and their elections are not predictable, as we've seen in the last 3 elections where they really changed directions in each one of those elections, but it was the will of the people at the ballot that changed the direction of the country. We should not be trying to micromanage the internal politics of Colombia, but rather establish a long-term partnership in the areas that I've mentioned. Do you have a strategy for dealing with the House on this issue?
So our strategy is to explain why the work that we're doing is important and yields benefits for the American people. Our assistance to other countries is not purely an altruistic exercise. We benefit from it. And in the case of Colombia, we benefit from a strong, stable, democratic, orderly Colombia, and we need to work with Colombia's elected leaders to achieve that.
Yeah, I strongly support that. We're going to always disagree with leaders of countries. We know there's different trends within our own hemisphere, but we do know that we need to have partners to deal with the anti-narcotics, counter-narcotics issues that are plaguing our country, and Colombia plays a key role. So I would just urge the administration to be a little bit more vocal in recognizing the importance of that partnership as we go into these negotiations between the House and the Senate. I want to ask you a second question about the OAS legislation that was authored in 2021 by Senator Wicker and myself to establish a parliamentary dimension within the OAS, similar to the OSCE. Can you tell me what steps you have taken to implement that law?
Thank you very much. And the meeting that you and Senator Wicker hosted with Secretary General Almagro, I think was, and a number of permanent representatives of other OAS member states, was important in helping them understand how this will work. They've had a number of discussions around the idea of a greater parliamentary engagement within the Americas. I think it is something that's gaining momentum in the institution. We continue to engage not only with the Secretariat, but with individual member states to talk about the importance and the utility of strengthening our legislative cooperation across the hemisphere.
I think it is gaining momentum, but I think it needs a push from the administration in its participation at OAS. I would just urge you, we recognize at times the administration is not going to be the strongest proponent for congressional involvement, but I would just urge that it is so critically important for the support of OAS to have more active parliamentarian participation. And the administration is at a key point, can play a major role in not just seeing momentum, but progress on a parliamentary dimension.
We engage and will continue to do so. We agree absolutely on the importance of this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Assistant Secretary Nichols, I want to begin by thanking you and the State Department for your efforts to secure the release of a constituent of mine and her child in New Hampshire last month who had been kidnapped in Haiti. Your efforts were really very helpful, and I know the family's not totally reunited because they had to leave some of their Haitian-born children in Haiti, but I appreciate that you're working closely with our office to help reunite the family and get those children back to the United States. So thank you very much for that. I want to echo the concerns that were expressed by both the chair and ranking member in their opening remarks about the missed opportunity that I think we have in the Western Hemisphere in Latin America. I had the opportunity in April to join a number of my colleagues on a bipartisan CODEL. We went to Panama, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. And one of the things that we heard everywhere we went was how much they wanted to have a positive relationship with the United States. They would like to see increased trade. They would like to see deeper relationships, and felt like they had not gotten a reciprocal response from the United States. I'm pleased that legislation that Senators Durbin and Bozeman and I have with to try and encourage increased trade to Latin America is in the Defense Authorization Bill. I hope that remains as the bill proceeds through Congress. But it felt like such a missed opportunity. So, I know we could spend the next 3 hours talking about that, but can I ask you to address that, Secretary Nichols?
Well, thank you so much. And engagement with this hemisphere is vital. Just last week, Costa Rican President Chavez was here. This coming week, we will have President Ali of Guyana here. President Biden hosted all the leaders of our hemisphere, all the democratically elected leaders of our hemisphere for the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. We hosted subnational leaders from our hemisphere and around the world in Denver, Colorado at the City Summit of the Americas. I accompanied Secretary Blinken to the 50th anniversary of CARICOM in Trinidad and Tobago. I was with Vice President Harris to meet with CARICOM in the Bahamas. President has been deeply engaged with our closest neighbors in Canada and Mexico in the North American Leaders Summit in Mexico City, and also bilaterally in Ottawa. This is a hemisphere that's vitally important, and America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity is another area where we expect to deepen our relations through work on infrastructure, climate, education, sustainable growth. Those are all areas of progress. And then we have 4 countries in our hemisphere that are members of APEC as well.
I appreciate that. I think all of those efforts are important. It still is not clear to me that we have a comprehensive strategy for how we're approaching Latin America. So I hope that as events continue, that will be clearer to us on the committee. One of the things that we visited on our trip was the Panama Canal, and as you know, the Panama Canal is being affected by significant disruptions because of climate change and the impact on the drought there, and that is having real disruptions in terms of increasing supply chain issues for consumers. Can you tell us whether the State Department is engaged with Panama in doing anything to address this, if there's anything that we are working on that can help as they think about how to deal with the water shortage, because this is clearly going to be a long-term issue?
Thank you, Senator. We are actively engaged with Panama on watershed management issues through USAID and State Department's Bureau for Oceans, Environment, and Science. Our ambassador, Mari Carmen Aponte, is very active on these issues as well. It's vital to our commerce and our security.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, last year, the Fentanyl Results Act that I was proud to co-sponsor with a bipartisan group of senators was signed into law. Can you tell me if anything is happening to implement that? I know the Senate Appropriations Committee has put in $125 million to try and stop the flow of fentanyl, but is there any work being done to specifically implement the provisions in that bill?
Senator, thank you for that question. As you know, the fentanyl crisis has been front and center for this administration. Secretary Blinken hosted a ministerial earlier this summer, over 100 countries, up to 100 countries, almost 100 countries and international organizations participated. We have working groups that are getting together to talk about implementing some of the things that came out of that ministerial. We will introduce a resolution at the UN at the upcoming UN General Assembly to tackle this issue. All of this to say, we are using every tool, including the tools that are provided by you all, by the Senate, to engage with our partners globally to fight this issue. We understand every day how important this is, both on the supply side and working with our partners domestically, ONDCP, on the domestic side, to make sure that that communities in the United States have what they need to address the addiction and overdose issues.
Well, sadly, in New Hampshire, we're seeing overdose deaths tick back up again. And so how do you define success? Do you have identified goals for interdiction, for reduction in amount of fentanyl coming into the country, for what China's providing in terms of precursor chemicals? What's the plan long-term to deal with this issue?
Well, those things that you mentioned are how we identify success. And while I'm saddened to hear that the numbers are ticking up in New Hampshire, my understanding is overall in the United States, the numbers are actually flattening, and in some areas going down. Part of this is the administration's attention, increased attention on the domestic side, again, making sure that communities are given the tools they need to give more access to treatment. But also part of this is our engagement globally with Mexico, with Colombia, with our European partners. And we have to remember that while in the United States, the issue is fentanyl, synthetic drugs globally are an issue. In the Middle East, it's ketamine. In Europe, it's methamphetamine. And we are engaged in offering tools to both our friends and our allies and our partners in the region to do the operations and to increase their security at their ports, to identify and engage with try to engage with the People's Republic of China on the issue of precursor chemicals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. I'm going to start a second round of questions that I have. I have been informed that it's unlikely that Senator Rubio will return. If he does, I'll offer him the opportunity to ask questions there is a vote on. If I could, Secretary Robinson, talk about the counter-narcotics cooperation level between the United States and Colombia and the new government. They're taking a somewhat different direction. I'd like to hear your assessment of how we view the partnership on counter-narcotics efforts.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I will start out by saying traditionally, the United States and Colombia have had an excellent security relationship. That relationship still continues. It's changing with the new administration. The new Petro government, they obviously want to go in a different direction on things like eradication. That said, they continue to work with us on interdiction. They continue to work with us on strategies for rural security. They continue to work with us on newer parts of our strategy that go after things like environmental crimes. We are working with our partners in AID on getting land titles to Colombians that have never owned the land that they're on before. we continue to have a comprehensive security and development engagement with Colombia. Colombia has become a provider of security, not just in the region, but globally, and we will continue to work on that.
That's helpful to hear that, and that matches what I've heard from General Richardson, the head of Southcom, that the change in government has not affected the mill-to-mill cooperative relationship. It is important for us to understand that this government is moving away from some of the eradication strategies, and that could have some challenges, but the fact that they are continuing to be a strong partner on interdiction and other security strategies, that is important to note. Secretary Nichols, just a couple months ago, in April of 2023, the administration announced the opening of safe mobility offices, also known as Movilidad Segura, in Colombia and Guatemala, where migrants can be considered for humanitarian or other lawful pathways from the Americas to the U.S. or other countries. The idea would be to have them go to those offices rather than appear at the frontera aquí. How does the funding for the safe mobility offices tie into the overall budget? And even though it's been fairly recent, since April, can you share how this strategy seems to be working?
Thank you, Chairman. I just note that Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources, Rich Verma, is in Guatemala and Colombia this week, precisely looking at the safe mobility offices. They're up and running there. And in Costa Rica, we had the chance to talk to President Chavez about that during his visit. They are processing applications for people. The idea is that this gives people access to lawful pathways for migration, reduces irregular migration, and has the opportunity for people to go not just to the United States, but other countries like Spain. People also receive information about ways that they can integrate into the societies where they are, should they wish to do so. The requests that we have will provide for training for the people who work at those centers, host nation officials in the migration management area, funding for our partners like the International Organization for Migration and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, this is a huge priority as a way to reduce the numbers of people arriving at our southwest border.
I think it's really an important strategy, and we'll want to continue to monitor its success. The success of these safe mobility offices also can have a significant effect in reducing the cartel soaking people for all their money and essentially human trafficking them. If there can be these offices near to where people are, where they can find information about lawful pathways and potentially receive a permission to come where they can buy an air ticket rather than pay a cartel thousands of dollars to traffic them on a dangerous journey to the border where they may or may not receive what they hope to. It'll also assure some safety and drain the cartels of some resources that they're now getting. A question about Chinese influence. Congress has appropriated funds generally to the Department of State to counter the influence of China globally. What do you do within your portfolio to make sure that those funds are being allocated appropriately to activities in the Americas? Because these are some global funds that could go everywhere, but I'd like to ask particularly how you go to bat to make sure that the Western Hemisphere receives a sufficient allocation of those funds.
Thank you, Chairman. Our focus in this hemisphere is making sure that countries have their eyes open about their engagements with China, particularly in areas like infrastructure investment. That means, in the United States, we have CFIUS to evaluate foreign investment. We want to build capacity in partner nations around the hemisphere so they can evaluate the quality of investments. We disseminate information about the opportunities through U.S. institutions like USAID, Development Finance Corporation, EXIM, We look for ways to partner with regional institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank. Just today, they announced a roadshow initiative to promote U.S. company investment in the hemisphere that would benefit from IDB financing, which I think is a great initiative. We work with cultural institutions to talk about the realities of the relations with China that they have, and to understand that if they've got a Confucius Institute in their country, what is that there for? What are they doing? What's the reality of the human rights situation in China?
If I could, Administrator Escobar, the USAID in May announced about $60 million in programming to Central America to combat gender-based violence and to advance human rights, HIV prevention. What type of programs is USAID implementing to break the cycle of gender-based violence against women in Central America?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. So, yeah, gender-based violence continues to be painfully prevalent in the region and far too normalized. So it is a priority in most of the countries that we operate, and our approach involves focusing on prosecution to increase the reporting and conviction of crimes, protection and victim assistance, and sometimes that involves going to the victims. We have mobile centers that go to the most isolated rural indigenous communities to provide services, and prevention, changing gender norms. So we've worked in some case very successfully with our partner countries. In Guatemala, we set up the 24-hour courts, and we piloted the first ones, and then the government took over. And we find that when you have the judicial centers that are specialized in these crimes, the impunity is reduced tremendously. So in El Salvador, we supported close to 40 victim assistance sentences, and the conviction rate in these cases was 5 times the average of the rest of the country. And lastly, in changing norms, that is a long-term endeavor, but we're tackling it in creative ways. In Honduras, we recently launched a 4-month campaign partnering with the major media company for airing a telenovela that features 4 women that have gone through overcoming discrimination, harassment, stigma, and really inspiring the audience to break the cycle of violence. So we're approaching it from all angles, and again, collaborating with our partner countries to reduce these numbers.
Very important work. My last question, Secretary Nichols, is for you. President Biden announced in June of 2022 the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. There has been criticism, and I've participated in the criticism, that the announced framework is still a little bit hollow in terms of accomplishment or achievement. I raised this at a recent hearing. We were informed that the White House and state were looking at APEP and maybe going to take a slightly different direction with it. We haven't heard anything since then. Is there anything to report now about APEP?
Well, we are robustly engaged in working with our partners among the 12 APEP countries. We're focusing on regional competitiveness, sustainable infrastructure, climate and environment, shared prosperity and good governance, and healthy communities, ensuring that people have access to health care in the region. We've been focusing on making sure that this is something that is a shared priorities among our partners in the region. Ambassador Lisa Kubicki has been leading our conversations, and former Senator Chris Dodd as well has been very active in outreach on these issues. We expect to have leaders meet later this year to talk about these priorities, and we will have a framework where ministers in key areas work together on concrete solutions. We expect to bring real, concrete, supportive resources to this exercise, but this is not the United States handing down a tablet from heaven. This is working with our partners to find shared approaches and shared solutions. Mr. Chairman, if I could just also note the importance for us, whether it's on engagement with our partners, APEP, competing with China. I want to thank you and this committee for everything that you can do to approve our and confirm our ambassadors in the region. The ability to speak at the ambassadorial level in countries is vital to our ability to counter China and to advance our own interests.
Thank you for that. I'd like to appreciate the witnesses for being here today. We had, I think, 8 senators, 6 of whom asked questions. That's positive. This is a really important priority. I'm going to ask that the record of this hearing be held open until the close of business Friday, so that if members of the committee, whether they were here or not, wish to direct questions in writing, they can do so by that date. And I would encourage you all to provide prompt and comprehensive responses should questions be directed in writing. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.